Hi, Lou here, and I'm going to talk about something that's fundamental to game design, but that some aspiring game designers have not yet sorted out in their minds, and that's the difference between a game and a story. Now, the first problem here, perhaps, is that people use the terms narrative and story interchangeably, and they're not. A narrative is simply an account of what happens. I went to the grocery store yesterday. I could write a narrative of that trip to the grocery store. That's not a story. It probably doesn't interest anybody except possibly my wife. And there's no characters, no protagonist and antagonist. You don't have a story structure and so on. If it were presented as a story, it would never be bought by any publisher because it lacks what makes a story good. Now think about that. A good story has certain elements in it. And not all narratives are stories, although all stories are narratives. Now, what do you get in a game? Your typical game always has a narrative. That is, what the players do. Each individual player has his or her own narrative. But is that a story necessarily? Sometimes, if it's a good game, it becomes a story. Or if it's, say, an historical game, then there's a story of the history underneath. In the extreme, the designer of the game, and especially video games, can impose a story on the players, and the players have to follow the story. It's also called a linear game, or on rails. You have to do what the designers want you to do. And puzzles are always that way because puzzles generally have a single solution, and so you have to follow that solution if you want to succeed. Games do not have single solutions in general, although many of the things we call games are in fact puzzles. Now, in the extreme, some video game designers usually, or RPG designers, want to, quote, craft a story and experience for our players, unquote. And the players are happy to follow that story. There may be branches in the story, but those branches usually lead back to the same results. The most famous example of that is Mass Effect, where at the end of the third Mass Effect video game, you had several choices, but they all amounted to the same thing, which really, really made players mad because Mass Effect had always advertised itself as something where there were a lot of possibilities, and in the end there weren't. But that's the nature of stories, that they go a particular way, the author controls what happens, and they end up where the author wants it to end up. So, many gamers play games. They don't consume stories. If I'm going to play a game, I'm not worried about consuming a story. If I want to consume a story, I'm going to read a book or watch a movie or watch a play or perhaps listen to an audio recording. I'm not going to play a game. I would rather consume a story from someone who is a professional at making stories rather than somebody who's designed a game and thinks that they're good at making a story, and maybe they are, but often they aren't. And you can ask yourself, what are the odds that you as a game designer are also really good at writing stories, and so you can impose stories on the players? The odds are you're not. If you were, you'd probably be creating stories in more common formats rather than in games. Games inherently make it difficult because there are so many choices, unless you force the game player to follow a certain set of choices, in which case it's no longer a game, it's a puzzle. This is a topic that some people find difficult, but if you think it through logically, it makes sense as I have described it. Thanks for listening.